All right. If everyone can take their seats. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to this will be our second panel, Fantastical Writings, hosted by Jael Richardson, will now begin. Round of applause for Jael.
Good morning, everyone. I heard breakfast was lovely. Yes, yes. Very sorry to have missed it. I was able to hear the panel from outside the doors, but good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is. In Ontario, where I'm from, it is good afternoon. In Saskatchewan and West, it is good morning. So we'll just cover all of our bases. My name's Jael Richardson. For those of you who don't know me, I am the executive director and founder of the Festival of Literary Diversity. I also write some books. I wrote The Stone Thrower, and the books that you can find out there are actually my debut novel, Gutter Child, along with a book that has not come out to the public yet, is not available in anywhere else but Moose Jaw until August 6th, which is a collection of short stories called Today I Am. It's 10 incredible writers from across the country, from diverse backgrounds and communities, stories told in fantastical spaces, contemporary spaces, told with poetry, told with comics, a really nice mix. If you have anyone who's aged 12 to 16. It's a really great way to kind of introduce them to smaller pieces of storytelling. Thank you for allowing me to plug myself before I plug these fabulous authors. You can also find my picture book Because You Are, which is, it's all right. Okay. I am here to celebrate these three amazing writers and to talk about fantastical writing, which is just, I think, one of the most fun subjects to talk about because you really get to go into this world and any other world that y'all have invented. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and starting with Jes. Jes Battis is from Chilliwack, BC, Stojo territory. They are the author of The Winter Night, Occult Special Investigator, and Parallel Park series. They teach literature, creative writing, queer and trans studies, and they write in the genres of urban fantasy, horror, and procedural crime. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. Law and Order fans, I love you. Okay.
Forgot the bump bump.
I know, I was gonna bump bump. We'll do that between questions.
Okay.
Victoria Koops' books are full of epic adventure and swoony romance and navigate social issues through the power of fandom and geek culture. Her debut novel is Who We Are in Real Life and was released this year from Groundwood Books. She's a practicing counselor who lives with her family in Treaty 4 territory. Yes. And Zalika Reid-Benta's debut short story collection, Frying Plantain, won the Danuta Glebe Literary Award and the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Literary Fiction in 2020. It was shortlisted for the 2020 Toronto Book Award, the 2020 Trillium Book Award, the 2021 White Pine Award, and the 2020 Evergreen Award. It is a very awarded book. Her picture book, 12 Days of Jamaican Christmas, will be published in 2025, so that's something to look forward to. And we're here celebrating her most recent book, which is River Mama, which came out last summer? Yes, last summer, because that's when I read it. So, great. Welcome. I love when we get a chance to go deep into genre and to talk really openly about a particular genre. And so I'm excited to talk about fantasy and fantastical worlds and fantastical fiction. And I want to start with your beginnings into this kind of genre, because I find people always have a pretty cool origin story. There's a film, a movie, a book that sort of sparked this kind of interest in worlds beyond ours. And so that's the question I wanted to start with. What sort of sparked your interest? And I'll start with you, Victoria, in this kind of fantastical kingdom building ideas. Yeah.
Cool. Well, full disclosure, I don't think of myself as a fantasy writer. Good. Or at least I haven't until I was invited to this awesome panel with legitimate fantasy writers. So I think I write contemporary romance kind of first in my head, and then I have elements of like nerd culture in there always. But then when being invited to this, I kind of realized like, oh, fantastical worlds or worlds beyond our own. I've been writing about that and trying to live that probably my entire life. So maybe I am a fantasy writer. That's kind of nice. For me, it started when I was very young with my dad playing D&D with us. So my obsession and love of...
Can you explain what D&D is?
Oh,
for
yes,
people who
yeah.
are-
For the uninitiated, D&D is Dungeons and Dragons. It's a tabletop role-playing game. I swear Wizards of the Coast should probably give me royalties how much I have to plug and explain their product when I talk about my own writing. But it's an immersive storytelling experience where you tell a goofy little fantasy story with your friends at a table, and you roll dice and crazy things happen, and you get to experiment with parts of yourself and like who you are inside or who you would like to be. And so it is about, it's set in a fantasy world, very Tolkien-esque usually, but it's very flexible. You can take it kind of anywhere. So I liked what you said, Jael, about like worlds beyond our own, because that's also fantasy, right? And our father played D&D with me and my sister over there. Shout out to Moira. When we were, I think she was 6 and I was 8, and he ran a campaign where I tried to use Moira as bait to escape the monster, and he said, "You can't sacrifice your sister." So anyway, and then since then, lots of like, video games, fantasy books, and more role-playing games all the way through, and then finally arriving at writing for myself and others. So that's it.
Love it. Jess, what about you? Do you consider yourself a fantasy writer? Or because I feel like Fantastical Worlds, we should premise, is about fantastic places and imagining and magic. They don't necessarily have to fit into that fantasy genre neatly.
Yes, I definitely consider myself a fantasy. I write lit fic. No, I just write. No, I write fantasy and speculative fiction. I think like most kids who grew up in the 80s, I was corrupted by the sort of trifecta of fantasy movies, which is The Neverending Story, Legend, and Labyrinth. Those were the 3 films that like radicalized me as a future fantasy writer. And especially when I read the actual book that The Neverending Story was based on, I was fascinated by how different it was from the film. But I do have a really kind of like core memory of being at a library book sale with my dad. This would have been in sort of the kind of mid to late 80s. And a book fell off a shelf. And it was by a children's author named Diane Duane, American children's author. She has a really, really popular series called the Young Wizard series, but I feel like it's never been adapted or anything. And this book was called So You Want to Be a Wizard. It was based on a sort of a series of self-help books from the 70s. So you want to be a nurse, but then so you want to be a wizard. And when I read the book, the main character discovers a spell book in a library in exactly the same way a book falls off a shelf. And I was like, am I the child who was ordained to do, like, am I the child of prophecy? So yeah, that was my origin story.
Love it. Zalika, your first book was a collection of contemporary short stories, and River Mama takes a different kind of turn in some ways. And so, for you, what was the inspiration, or like how did that start? Was that something you always wanted to write more about?
Yeah, so I always say that I write for my younger self. And when I was a preteen to a teenager, I really wanted to write a high fantasy novel. So for me, it was like growing up in like the 90s, 2000s, it was like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. And I remember when Lord of the Rings first came out, I was blown away to the point that like in school, I started trying to write like my homework the way that the Elvish like language left, and I got in trouble because my teachers were like, "We don't understand." So my mom had to sit me down, like, Zalika, I know it looks really pretty, but they can't understand it. And I was very defiant, so I was just like, I'm gonna try like one more time, and they were like, no, or we're gonna fail you with your like English papers. So then I had to like acquiesce. But it was really funny talking to my mom, who like, when she did read the book, she was like, yeah, I'm seeing all of the stuff that you were like really into as a kid, especially because I grew up on a lot of movies, and River Mama has a little bit of environmentalism in it. And so she was like, yeah, that's like Fern Gully over there, and that's Lord of the Rings over here. And so I was just like, oh yeah, I didn't really think of like the other things that came together. But because this is all to say that I wanted to write a high fantasy novel about Jamaican folklore. And so I was writing that for a very long time. But it was also after writing short stories for years, so I was learning how to write a novel, which means it was awful. It was like 400 pages, halfway done. The chapters were like 30 pages long. I didn't know what I was doing. The world building was a mess. But I just really wanted to get these ideas out about like fantasy and folklore. And then like midway through a sentence, I started writing River Mama, and my agent was like, this is the book that you were trying to write, but you just didn't know that you were writing. So it was kind of like a twisty-turny voyage to my quest of a novel.
I love that. I love it, and I love when questions lead to the next question. It makes my life easy. I wanted to give a chance to allow you to share a little bit about the premise of this book that you've written. And what I love to hear from authors is, a little bit about obviously what this book is about, but where it began for you. Like, what was the initial idea that set it in motion? How close is the final product to where you originally started? Zalika, you started a little bit. Maybe we'll pitch back to you to sort of say, where did River Mama begin as an idea, which you sort of led into a little bit, and how close is it to what you have now?
Okay.
And a little bit about what it's about.
Okay, so River Mama is a book about my main character, Alicia, and her two co-workers who kind of become her friends. And they are given this task by the Jamaican water deity, River Mama, whose job is to protect all of the rivers in Jamaica, but that kind of leads to the rivers of the world. And she has a comb that was stolen from a Toronto tourist, and she tasks Alicia to find it, and they have a day, or else River Mama's gonna leave and take all the waters with her, which isn't good. And then as that's happening, they're being chased by these malevolent spirits called duppies, which are like, Jamaican ghosts, and it's just a quest throughout Toronto. So my original idea was the high fantasy novel where I was gonna have like a character who did something like really, really bad, but didn't mean to do something really bad, and she kind of has to go on a run, and as she goes on the run throughout this like fantastical world, she's being chased by duppies. So that part is still the same, the being chased by duppies part, but the fact that I made it in Toronto is what is different, and that's just because there were a lot of things happening in Toronto at the time with regards to culture, specifically urban culture and Jamaican culture and Toronto culture, and this idea of who started Toronto slang, this idea of appropriation of Jamaican or Caribbean foods. And so because all of this was happening, all the while I was in my 20s, and I kept seeing all these different articles about what it means to be a millennial 20-year-old, and I didn't relate to any of it. I was just like, commuting is not my biggest problem, and I don't like avocado toast, and I don't know why this is like me and my friends were like, this is not about us. This is not what our experience is. And so I decided to make it a very millennial but fantastical book where I bleed the two things that I really wanted to talk about together. And so when I was talking to my publisher, we're like, it's not really fantasy, but it's not really like just like, it's not fantasy. So then we just decided on magical realism.
Love it. Victoria, what about you?
Yeah, okay. I have a very core memory of driving down a Saskatchewan dirt road on my way to my job at the library in Estevan, Saskatchewan, where I was a library programmer, and we were having a really difficult time engaging a very specific demographic, namely like men in their 20s to 50s. Yeah, use the library, come on. And so I was like, oh, I know what we're going to do. We're going to offer the nerds nerd things, and we'll get men in here. And so it worked. We started playing Magic the Gathering twice a week, and also D&D twice a week, with 4 different groups in D&D. So I had volunteers in the community. Every single program was full. This is Estevan, Saskatchewan. Do you know, like, that's like half the city was coming to this program. The branch manager was really excited about it. And it's because, like, queer culture is what I write about, but nerd culture also brings people together. And I was driving to work on my way to run D&D, like probably the second time that week, while also playing in my own D&D games with my friends. I think I was playing D&D 4 times a week. And I was like, I'm going to write a book. I've always been destined to write a book. This is my quest. I love that you said your quest of a book. That's what it is. What do I know enough about to write a book? And kind of had a light bulb moment that the only thing I know enough about is tabletop role-playing games, because I was so immersed in D&D at the time. And so I started writing that, and my book is about teenagers who use tabletop role-playing games to explore who they want to be in real life, and that's why it's titled the way it is. They have Darcy is the female protagonist, and she's moving to a small rural town with her 2 moms. Her moms are the first openly queer couple in this small town, and one of them is the new doctor. And then, meanwhile, born and raised in this small town, which could be set in Saskatchewan or literally anywhere, with shortgrass prairies. The boy, the male interest in the story, is grew up in this small town. His dad's a very conservative, like, kind of figure in this town, but has gone away a lot for work, and so he's kind of parentified and raising himself and his younger sister. He escapes into D&D, and he invites Darcy to play D&D with him and his friends, and they build this beautiful connection. And then they realize that they want to make some changes in their small town and start up a queer straight alliance, where, yeah, you can imagine how that goes, and that's why there's a book and a plot and all that thing, because lots of conflict comes out of that. But then they start to play together, and the D&D campaign that they play together starts to mirror their real life, and they use their heroes in-game to be brave so that they can be brave in real life. And yeah, so that's kind of how I went from, running 4 D&D campaigns in a week to writing this story. And then a really great piece of advice that I got along the way was from Stephen Heighton, who said, write what haunts you. And I realized really quickly that my book was actually about small town homophobia, not just a cute little silly book about dragons and wizards and witches and fantasy. And so it came together kind of similarly, I think, to Zalika. So yeah, that's my quest and journey.
That leaves you, Jes.
It's me, isn't it? So The Winter Night is it's an urban fantasy, which means kind of like a fantasy story set in a big city. It's also a murder mystery. Ooh. And
Bum, bum.
bum, bum. And it's about the knights of King Arthur's court, if they were alive and well in contemporary Vancouver, and all the kind of drama they get up to. The first image I had of this book, which I like that you talk about haunting, because this image kind of haunted me. I imagined years earlier someone trapped on a SkyTrain in Vancouver, and what would happen if the SkyTrain kind of burst off the track and started flying. So that was the only image I had to work with. But I wasn't really sure where the story was going. And then I was teaching, I teach at the University of Regina, and I teach a class on the literature of King Arthur. And my Arthurian Lit students, almost every one of them said, we don't care about King Arthur. He's so boring. We care about the wizards. We like Merlin, and we like Morgan Le Fay. And I was teaching an epic medieval poem called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight main character is a sort of young, untried knight who doesn't really know how to be a knight. And several of my students observed that, he just seems kind of nerdy and anxious. He doesn't really know what to do. And I wondered, how might that translate into sort of a first-year university student? And so that became one of the central characters, Wayne, who is a reincarnation of Sir Gawain. He's a queer, autistic, first-year college student trying to negotiate the disability accommodation system, which is not helping him because of his borderline diagnosis. So all of those kind of different steps were what led to the novel in its current form. But I'm really grateful to my students for all of the vibrant conversations we had about King Arthur. And I will always remember them saying, King Arthur sucks, he's so boring. We just want to know about the wizards.
You all have mentioned some really classic films and pieces that we learn about these worlds that are invented, languages that come from different places and spaces that are totally created. And what I thought was really interesting about all three of your books is that they have these fantastic elements, but they're set in these very Canadian locations. And so I wanted to take a minute to talk about setting, about your choice to set them in these very particular places. I know for you, Victoria, yours wasn't as it is this place, but I think,
If
it
you know,
is.
you know.
Yeah,
If
it
you know,
is,
you know.
right? So I felt comfortable asking this question. What made you choose those places? And I want to talk about the strengths and also the challenges that come with choosing those places, right? There are things that make it easier to pick, Toronto or Vancouver maybe, but there's also things in a fantastical world that also make it a little bit more complicated. So can you talk about some of the things that you wrestled with and the decisions behind your settings? Go ahead.
I'll dive in. So I purposely obscured my setting because when I had the realization that my book was actually about homophobia in rural small communities, I wanted it to be able to be accessible to every rural small queer baby out there who's living a very isolated life against some really kind of bleak, hopeless prairie landscape. Not that the prairie landscape is bleak and hopeless. As we learned this morning, it's beautiful and diverse, and just having queer kids in rural spaces is beautiful and diverse, right? And so I obscured it so that people beyond Saskatchewan, because to be honest, many people don't even know how to spell Saskatchewan or pronounce it properly. Just called Jess out on panel.
Just attacked by Victoria Koops, everyone.
He's only lived, or they've only lived here. How long have you been here? Long time.
14 years.
Sorry, friend.
But I bet you could draw it, though.
Yeah, you could draw it. You could draw it, right?
I would say that.
So that, someone in Oklahoma could pick this up and be like, oh, there's a lot of familiarity in this book. Or I had people ask if it was set in Texas, which tells you something about our own landscape here. Political and otherwise, but in the end, it is set in Saskatchewan. There are things that are pulled right from our headlines, our news lines, like the burning of pride flags, and there's context that's pulled right from the lives of my Queer Straight Alliance students. And I think when you're from this landscape, you really know that it's rooted here, and prairie roots go deep, 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 right? And so, when setting the novel, I wanted it to be obscure enough, but I also wanted it to be the city that is never named is the city. And if you're anywhere, if you can throw a rock at Regina, it's the city, right? So those are some of the in real life setting elements that I was really intentional about in the fantasy components of my novel, because it kind of braids through the 3 points of view, the 3 perspectives. I had so much fun. It was so liberating to just be and now I don't have to be too too rigid with how I develop a fantasy world, because the fantasy world was able to be more flexible and fluid. And I pulled elements from a variety of Canadian landscapes. Like there's pine trees, and actually like driving through the mountains was something, but also then like deforestation and like clearing the plains were elements that I wanted to represent in the fantasy setting. Water sovereignty and pollution was like a big theme that I wanted to weave in, because there's a whole like fantasy plot around like polluted waters and kind of environmental damage, because like environmental justice is justice for everyone, just like queer justice is justice for everyone. Which is a really serious thing to say on a fantasy panel now that I'm like saying it out loud. But it was just really liberating and really fun. So like being able to, I think, swing between like some really rooted, grounded settings into something more flexible and liberating, and then back and forth between that. That's what I love about the fantasy genre and about like worlds beyond our own. Because you can get real deep and magical when you braid those things together. So.
Zalika, what about you? Toronto is a very particular choice. Even like in Canada, to choose to set a book in Toronto does a particular thing. And so what went into that decision? Were there any sort of challenges that you had to navigate, or also some of the things that were beneficial from it?
I think for me is I did the exact opposite of you, where I was just like, no, we're gonna like root it really in Toronto. I think because I work from universality through specificity, and so I basically wanted to treat Toronto like it was Middle Earth. I wanted to treat it like it was a fantastical world. So I used like exact street names. I used things like Petro Canada. I used like the Tim Hortons and everything. And my characters, because they're broke and they're 20 and it's winter, so they don't really get to drive anywhere. They have to take the TTC, which is horrible. And like, you know, there's fires at Christie, and there's like different, like they just, basically, like the city itself became an obstacle as much as the fantastical elements of the Duppies and everything like that. And it was really interesting because I wanted to bleed the fantasy and the contemporary together, because thematically the fantasy was about heritage, the fantasy was about the effects of colonialism, the fantasy was about home. And then because my main character is a recent grad who's living at home and doesn't know what to do and think life sucks because things aren't going according to plan, the things like the subway being down, or not having enough money, or like going to the Royal York Hotel, that was basically about being in your mid-20s or early 20s in life and trying to figure your way. So it kind of became that even though I treated everything like it was fantastical, there actually isn't a fantastical world in my book. She goes back in time to visit her ancestors, or her ancestors come to her. So they go from Jamaica, and there is like an ancestral realm that's in the book, but according to many different people, that ancestral realm is real. So I didn't really treat it like fantasy necessarily, more just like spirituality. And there's magic, but there's magic in the real world. So yeah, it's really interesting talking about worlds in that sense, just because it's all treated as real as opposed to fantastical.
Jes, you chose Vancouver as the setting for your book. Again, a place that has especially for Canadians, a very distinct sensibility. Did that come right away? You knew what went into that?
Vancouver was a very deliberate choice. I've lived in Vancouver for a long time, and I often think of it as a fantastical city. In some ways, it's like a simulation of a city. If you've been to Vancouver, it's a city that's constantly trying to erase its own history. It's a city that constantly appears in media, but not as itself. It's always something else. And it's a city where maybe 1% of people can afford to live. All of my friends that still live in Vancouver are constantly terrified of being evicted or rent-evicted. Everyone is in a complex rental arrangement. And so I imagined it as a city where these kind of fantastic beings would be drawn to, but then they would struggle to survive. You know, King Arthur is kind of living on a sky train at one point. Queen Guinevere is teaching as an adjunct instructor at a university. She's making 25% of the wage of a tenure track instructor to teach Arthurian literature, which is actually her life. And so I chose Vancouver for the kind of the blend of the very old and the very new, and to think about how those things would interact. And thinking as well about how there's a whole Musqueam settlement underneath Vancouver, the city of Tsasneam, and Vancouver is on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. And you mentioned, Jael, like some of the challenges that we came up against. One of the challenges I encountered is that I didn't want there to be any confusing overlap between European mythologies and indigenous cosmologies and worldviews. In no way did I want to suggest that those cosmologies and those protocols and those ways of being were somehow mythologies, like King Arthur. And so what I tried to do instead was to concentrate on the characters who were European myths and forcing them to question the centrality of their own myth cycles. You know, why do all of my university students have knowledge of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but they've never read a poem in Plains Cree, or they're not familiar with an indigenous director? So I tried, in facing that challenge, I think what I tried to do was to get those characters that were rooted in the European stories to think more and more about their complicity and how storytelling, you know, it should be a kind of rich transmission of values, but at the hands of colonialism, it can also be weaponized, and it often is weaponized.
Sarah, what's the end time for this? I should know this. 12. Okay. I should know that. I don't always remember. And then I get on stage and I'm like, well, I should check now. Because I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions from folks. So I want to ask this one before I turn it over to some audience questions. Just a reminder as you prepare to think about questions, the only requirement for questions is that they be questions. So please make sure that your question is a question and one singular question. So the question I wanted to ask you guys before we turn it over is there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of like snottiness, snootiness, whatever words you want to use about the fantastic, the mystical, the magical. There's lots of people who will, there's like diehard fans, but then there's also people who are on the opposite end who were like, I just don't read that. What do you think about that as you're writing? Do you care about that? And what do you sort of say to those people who are sort of like, well, I don't really read fantasy? Even for those of you who don't, in many ways, all your books sort of take a different approach on the genre, quote unquote, fantasy. But you know, including magic, including anything like that, people are like, I don't do that. What do you say? How do you deal with that as you're writing? Do you care? These are big.
Well, I didn't really think about it when I was writing, but I actually got into an argument with a friend because he has a niece and he's like taking her on to like tutor and like wanted to do different books, and I was suggesting a bunch of different books that were all fantastical, and he was like, no, I want something realistic, and I was like, why? I was like, why?
Pop off, yes.
And so then I don't even really remember his answer. I just remember I was like, well, I just want you to know that when I was younger, I read a lot of fantasy books, and it helped with my imagination. It helped with my critical skills. It helped me write. It helped me become where I am now. So I think that if you allow your niece to read more fantastical books, then maybe you will find that she has a fantastic imagination. Maybe she'll be inspired. Maybe she wants to write. Maybe she wants to direct. Maybe it will help her, find herself. And then he got really quiet on text. And then he was like, okay, maybe I'll start, because I think I recommended, I forget what I recommended, but it was like a young adult Afrofuturism novel. So then he was like, okay, I'll start with that. And I was like, yeah, you will.
Do you think about it when you're writing? Do you think like, oh, maybe that's too much, or that's, are you thinking about a reader who is hesitant about it as you're writing? Or are you sort of like, I do what I do?
I can't think about the reader while I write, or else I'll never write, because then because when we came to the editing session, particularly with this book, and especially because this book is also in the States, and they're leaning heavily more towards the fantasy side, but because it doesn't have certain requirements that people would think of when it comes to fantasy. So when we started getting like reviews from like the book talk girlies and everything, like, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have that, and I was like, yeah, because it's not really fantasy, but it's also not really like lit. It's a combination of both. It's a mashup. So I didn't really want it to be leaned heavily on either side, because I was like, it's neither and it's both and it's everything. And then they were like, we can't market that. So like, you have to choose something. But if I had thought about that while I wrote, then I wouldn't have written the book that I wrote, because then I would be too focused on it has to fit in a particular genre. So I just focused on, what do I want to do? I'm going to do it. And at the end, if people get it, then that's great. And when people don't get it, that sucks. But that's what it is to be a writer. Not everyone's going to understand your intentions, and that's fine. So that's how I kind of approached it.
Victoria.
Okay, I was looking at Jess to be like, go next.
Jess does this magical thing where they kind of like look off.
Jess is
and
definitely like making
does
direct
not make eye contact
with the audience.
That I know.
thanks.
They're waiting for their
I'll
moment.
go next. I got
It's
you.
called autism.
Okay,
It's all good.
Yeah. Okay. Can I get you to repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
That's called ADHD.
So the question is about sort of the people who look down on fantasy,
Right,
and
right,
whether
right.
you think about that as you're writing, what you would say
Yeah.
to people who are hesitant.
Okay. I do think about my audience when I write, but I write for teenagers, so I'm thinking about myself as a teenager a lot of the time, and writing for like my inner child, while also writing for like my students. And I kind of just feel like, but that doesn't get in the way. Like, it doesn't get in the way like it would for you, because children are way more playful and way more forgiving and generous and kind. We can learn a lot from our youth. And so, yeah, it doesn't get in the way, I think, the same way as, thinking about lit reviews or Kirkus or book talk, right? Where I think my heart is with this question is that I kind of just feel sad that that's a position that like serious literary people have, or people or readers even, that they're like, read something realer. Yeah. When I'm like, magic is all around us. Life is magical. And beautiful and hopeful, and that's what fantasy is about. And so I'm like, it's just really bleak and sad when you limit yourself to like writing or reading something serious because that has more value somehow, when I think there's so much goodness to get out of being able to suspend reality. I'm going to put on my like counselor glasses for a second, because in my day job, I'm a high school social worker and student counselor, and I use play a lot in my practice, because when you play, what our brains do is we suspend reality, which means that we can be brave and we can explore things that are too scary to explore when it's us telling our personal like firsthand trauma, right? But when you have this tool, this therapeutic tool of storytelling or play to suspend reality, then you can get into some really deep things, and that's magic. It's transmutation of trauma. And I'm like, holy moly, that's the realest real thing that I do. And I do that every day. And so both as a writer, as a counselor. And I just think it's really sad that that's somehow undervalued in literary circles or in society maybe in general, because there's a lot of healing that comes out of that. And for me too, as the writer, there's a lot of healing writing something that I needed as a teenager, right? A story that I needed to see on shelves. And I hope to do that with the rest of my writing career and with the rest of my counseling career, so.
It's a great one too, because there's this really amazing way that magic allows us to discuss things and approach things that we are a bit uncomfortable to address just like head on, you know? It gives you the space, and what I love about books is that you read them at your own pace too. So you have these difficult moments, you have these magic moments that like you're struggling with, you can just put it down for a little bit and pick it up a little bit later, you know? And there's not many mediums that allow that kind of paced approach.
And I would assert like magic is a literary device. Yeah. I could get literature on this conversation. Yeah. If I needed to show my credentials, I have receipts. Yes. Like magic is a literary device. Yeah. So if we want to get into the craft, the weeds about like the value of all the like skill that it takes to write and compose a fantasy or a sci-fi or a world beyond our own, I'm like, that takes a lot of craft skill. Yeah. And then to be able to like engage in contemporary fiction while doing that, which is like what all of our books do, that takes even like deeper skills, because now you're blending genre and the market doesn't like that, right? So yeah, I think that's like when you want to be like flex a little bit, you can flex, but then it's just the reason that you need to do that just makes me feel really, really like empathetic and sad for that positioning, I guess, right? And I'm like, I want you to be able to experience magic and laugh, like, or I don't know. Anyway, so Jess, do you have anything to add? Stare up here.
I love it.
I teach the history of fantasy literature, and I often have really interesting conversations with students, and I'll often start classes on fantasy and speculative fiction by saying the first fantasy novel I remember reading was the Bible. And sorry, it divides the room, usually divides the room. And we sort of go from there and thinking about what is fantasy, you know? Well, like, obviously the Bible's got everything. It's got necromancy, it's got floods, it's got fires, it's got lightning, it's got shape-shifting. But the sort of boundaries that we often put around fantasy are produced more by publishers and by booksellers than anything else. There's also, I think, a real disconnect in fantasy media in terms of what gets visualized versus what is actually quite popular within all these kind of diverse canons of fantasy literature. I think of an interview with the author N.K. Jemisin where an interviewer asked her what it sort of felt like to be an emerging author when her 5th season series came out, and she was like, I've been writing since the 90s. I think, like, why did we rush 2 Dune movies into production when, like, Nnedi Okorafor's series has been in adaptation hell for, like, 10 years? There's a real kind of whiteness that comes in terms of the media representation of fantasy. But when you look at the genre itself, it's extraordinarily diverse. There's an extraordinary number of queer and trans writers and writers of color, but their work often doesn't get visualized because it doesn't, you know, the Netflix executives aren't sure if it's going to make that Netflix money that they want. So there's all kinds of economic forces as well. And I'll end by just thinking about, I was talking to a student trying to recommend where they might send their manuscript, and I thought, there's this Canadian publisher, I'm not going to name them, I thought it would be really perfect for their work. And I just wanted to check their submission guidelines because I wasn't sure if the student would be able to kind of translate those guidelines right away. Very first thing that comes up, no genre fiction. And I'm like, you've published a ghost story. You've published fantasy novels. But the idea that, okay, there's either literary fiction or fantasy fiction or speculative fiction. Those categories are really illusory, and they're based on more on economics than anything else.
We do something at Fold called a reading challenge, and each month we sort of challenge people to read outside of into a different place. It might be a place they read often, and maybe a different month challenges them more. But I really want to challenge you, if you have not read magical, if you have not read fantastical, if you've been avoiding fantasy, find something that challenges you in that area in the best possible way. You don't have to go like super like Space Jam type vibes. There's especially in these 3 books, there's a nice range of different kinds, different depths into the magic and fantasy, but really thinking through also as you read them, what are sort of the prejudice that I hold? What is it keeping me from reading more of? What is it keeping me from exploring or learning? Especially when you're talking about marginalized communities, it's such a powerful way to kind of explore the bias that gets kind of entrenched in our reading practice as well. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Johnny 1, first hand up. If there's any other questions or hands that go up. Yep, and then over there. So we're gonna take these 2 questions and then we'll wrap up today's panel.
Thanks, everyone. This has been awesome. You've talked a lot about different factors and influences and situations, and I'd want to bring this a bit. I'm trying to stick to Jael's note, 1 question. So this is a question. In the reality we live in now, where fantasy is often a survival mechanism and an escape route, and also teaching, and it's also a space where things get banned. And so in your processes as writers, and also when in your processes, you're all teachers in many ways, between the creation process and the publication, book out in the world process, or whatever medium you choose, have there been those dialogues about worry or consideration of things considered being banned, or how you navigate that, and how, that's a question, right? Yeah.
That's an excellent question. I just expect to be banned. That's how I deal with that. I'm just like, bring it on. Teenagers, my audience, will just get the book. They sneak out to go to parties. If they're sneaking out to go to parties, they're gonna just find the stories that they need to survive. And let me tell you, more and more, they do need these narratives, these stories to survive. And so I don't think my books aren't super punchy, but I don't really pull punches when I'm crafting them. And I'm very fortunate to have editors who aligned with those values. And so I didn't have to pull punches. And then, they'll find, the people who need to find them will find them. So tell a friend.
Okay. We're in a moment where pretty much everything with queer and trans content is going to be banned. It's going to be defined as pornography. That's essentially, that's spilling over from the US as well. And so I've been lucky in my career to have really supportive editors. I remember when I was pitching my second series, I said, it's a book about a bunch of nerdy role-playing grad students who end up in another dimension, and they're all gay. And the editors were like, cool. And I said, don't you think that's kind of a narrow audience? And they're like, no, it sounds good. But all I can suggest is just trying to flood the market with as much of those identities and that content as possible. Not just, writing sex scenes, but writing like queer intimacies, writing stories about ace and aromantic characters, like writing about gender and sexuality. Casey Plett in interviews has talked about write stories about trans people being boring, because it's like trans people are boring sometimes. I just, keep flooding the market with those stories so that they'll have to define all of the literary canon as pornography.
I'll just say my way. In the anthology, I grew up in a very Christian home. Still would describe myself as a person of faith. And when we did the anthology, I wanted to make sure that there was a wide range of people, and of course, then you get a wide range of stories. And some of the stories, one of the stories in particular, was very explicitly queer. And we had the question about, do you put the story a little bit later in the book and hope people don't realize it till they take it home? And we actually made it the opening story of the anthology. And we were kind of like, if people are going to read one story and say that this is, say whatever they say when they say these ridiculous things, like let them say it right out the gate and not hide what's inside. So, yeah.
Amazing. My question is kind of on the lines of that and continuing the discussion about your stories and these fantastical elements that you have explored in your books. And I guess what are you guys looking for in the future? What do you want to explore in your books with the elements of fantasy and also bringing in the real life again?
That's a good way to wrap it up.
That's an excellent question to finish on. But I've gone first like a lot, so I feel like I would like one of my panelists to go first.
Zalika, you didn't answer
I think it's because I don't really know what I'm writing until I write it that I can't say, because I didn't know I was writing River Mama until I wrote it. And it's become a thing where I talk to my agent, where I start, like, I'm in the middle of 2 books that are like 100 pages each. And she's like, I don't know if you're gonna finish it. Like, I don't know if this is what's gonna be. So all I can say is that I think I'm all about trying to represent the things that I wanted to see when I was younger. And so when I was younger, I really wanted to see more things about Jamaican folklore. I wanted to see more Canadian Black girls as protagonists. I just wanted to see something that I could relate to, something that would make me feel seen. I remember, it's not fantasy, but I remember the first time I saw the play The Kink in My Hair, and I was crying in the theater because I had never seen anything about how Black girls deal with their hair, or how Black girls, or even just being in a Black hair salon. And so I think what I always think of when I do my book, if I think of the reader at all, it's that I just want to have, or I would be like the greatest thing if I could inspire that reaction in a reader. And so whether that's through blending fantasy and contemporariness, or it's purely fantasy, or if it's contemporary, then it doesn't really matter what form it takes, as long as I'm able to elicit that reaction. So I'm not sure if that if that answers the question, but that's just my thought process of the whole thing.
Should I go? Okay.
Don't look at me like that. You make me seem like a really big bully.
It's your sister who's the bully. We all know
Yeah, exactly.
I've been talking a lot with friends about a film that recently kind of stormed the film circuit called I Saw the TV Glow. I don't know if anyone's seen this. It's like it's a kind of trans-helmed film about trans people growing up in the 90s and sort of early 2000s, and just their engagement with fantasy. And I'm working now on a novella set in the 90s, and it's reminded me like how homophobic the 90s were. Even though it's like we had Ellen, well, yeah, not until like 1997, the sort of the most of the 90s, and even after that. So I'd like to see more stories with trans and non-binary characters engaging with fantasy in the way that like the white farm boy hero in epic fantasy has always engaged with fantasy, and also more stories with like neurodiverse characters who aren't like criminal profilers and things like that. Like, yeah, that's my wish.
So I'm currently working on 2 manuscripts, and one is contemporary YA fiction because, like I admitted earlier, I don't necessarily see myself as a fantasy writer, but it does deal with nerd culture and geek culture. The second, and this is the one that is haunting me a lot, and so it will be one that will be finished eventually. It has to do with racial ambiguity. My father is Japanese Canadian, and I look like this. So I'm learning how to understand my identity and being kind of whitewashed. I have a really fantastic, awesome family that really centered a lot of our family teaching on privilege and power and how to disrupt privilege and power. But in that process, kind of forgot that like my grandmother and grandfather were put into work camps, labor camps here in Canada. And so I'm going to write about that, and it's going to be set at Comic-Con, where all sorts of wild things happen. And it will be kind of a novel about fantasy and how cosplay can be used to explore identity as well, and reclaim kind of lost parts of identity, because I think if there's anywhere that like yokai, which are Japanese ghosts and spirits, not just ghosts, but like weird, creepy, fantastical monster creatures, if there's anywhere that they're going to hang out, it's comic convention, because if you've ever been to one, you understand. And so that's where I think I'm headed eventually, but that's like, I kind of surprised that I even brought that up, because I don't actually, not super confident taking up that space yet because of the way I look and the way I present. And so someday that novel will hit shelves, and it'll be when I've had some time to kind of process being white presenting and not taking up that space and owning that identity without while balancing it against my white privilege, right? And that's a really complex and personal exploration, which is why that book is like getting so many starts and stops along the way. The main character is half Scottish, half Japanese, and doesn't look Japanese. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much.
I just want to thank everyone for being here. This is my last event of the festival, so I also want to just say thank you for having me again. It's my third time. I hope it's not my last time. Thank you to our panelists. If I can just get you to close your eyes for a moment. I want you to think about someone whose birthday is coming up, or a teenager who's going back to school. Okay, you can open your eyes, and I want you to go out to that book table and find some books for that person, get it signed. This is a really special moment where you can have the authors put their names inside your book, and it's not an opportunity should be missed. It's what makes festivals so unique and special, so do that. I also want to challenge you to spend this year thinking about one question that I always leave people with, which is who's missing? I want you to think about the books you've read the past year, the past few years, and to think about who's missing from that lineup of books. Trans writers, queer writers, trans writers of color, queer writers of color, disabled writers, and really spend this year looking for books from folks in those communities to fill in those gaps in your reading list. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jael.
Thanks,
Thank
Jael.
you.
Thanks again to all of you for celebrating 28 years of the festival. And just because the summer festival is over, it does not mean you have to wait until next year to participate. The Saskatchewan Festival of Words has year-round programming, including Performers Cafe, open mic night at the and Cineviews film series starting back up again in September. More programs will be announced in the coming months, so watch for details on those and more in the festival newsletter, website, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, as well as local news sources. Okay, time for the real reason you all came. So first we have the raffle.
Oh, we didn't do a raffle.
No?
We did do a raffle.
Oh, we didn't do a raffle. Okay.
I did a typo. There is no raffle.
Moving on.
Wristband.
first up is wristbands for a medium basket of books valued at $200. And the winner is... If it's Glenda, she can't win. Randonna Swan? Woo! She snuck hers in at the very end. So next up is the... So there'll be a $200 and a $100 book basket. Perfect, from the evaluations. And the winner for the $100 book basket is... Woo. And finally, we have the Big Door Prize for Festival Pass evaluation form. So the largest basket of books valued at $300. And the winner for that will be... Tracy Mitchell. Your turn.
Oh, it's my turn. Tracy reads more than most people I know. I feel like she's probably read everything in her book already, or in her basket already. So before I let you go, a huge thanks again to our funders, without which none of this would be possible. So Sask Arts, Canada Council for the Arts, Government of Canada, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, the City of Moose Jaw, and the Barry and Dee Dee Wigmore Foundation, as well as a long list of program and event funders and sponsors. Thanks also to our team of tireless volunteers, of course our highly dedicated and supportive board of directors, Glenda Julian, Carrie Reuter, Meredith Hagel, Jean McElrath, Angie Abdu, Shelley Rucker, and Lisa Fisher, as well as our HR advisor, Sarah Francis. Yes, they put in a ton of work for us. Our book supplier, McNally Robinson, our tireless bookstore team, Susan Gardner and Nelson Reed. Also, I wanted to give a shout out to Nelson's wife, Wanda, who is running the store so he can help run our on-site store. Gwen Fisher and Siobhan Ruby and the entire team at the Moose Jaw Public Library, as well as Jen McRory, Violet Tang, and the team at the Moose Jaw Museum Art Gallery. Now, here's the fun part. This is my favorite part, where we get to announce like a taster of who's coming next year. So we already have a sneak peek. So 2025 festival, we need the drum roll again. We're hiring a drummer next year. Okay, first one, Heather O'Neill. Heather O'Neill is coming. She had to cancel on us once, and I've been assured she's going to come this time. So we'll hold her to that. I've got everyone here is going to hold her to that. Another festival favorite who we're going to have back is Danny Ramadan. Oh, yeah. Ooh, he got a shout there. That's good. And someone we've been trying to get here for a very, very, very long time. And I'm going to give credit where credit is due. Amanda secured this one for us. Richard Van Camp will be coming next year. Finally, we're going to get him here. So we're really excited. So before I let you all go, of course, I want to recognize the amazing team that I get to work with almost every day, except for Allie, our summer intern. We only get her for the summer, but we're really hoping she'll come back next year. So Allie Zarubin is back for her second year, and hopefully I can say next year she's back for her third year. Our incredible program coordinator, Sarah Grimes, we'd be lost without her, absolutely. And the operations manager, the always amazing Amanda Farnell. So that's it for the Saskatchewan Festival of Words of 2024. I hope you all had a fantastic time. Based on all the feedback I got, that's true. So we'll see what you really think when we read through your evaluation forms. But I hope to see you all back here next year. So get your hotel rooms booked now. Mark your calendars. We sold out of stuff this year, so get your tickets and passes early when they go on sale in April next year. Safe travels home, everyone.